Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. We're live here in Israel, and I'm happy to have all of you here with us from all around the world. We have with us tonight MK Nitzan Horowitz, chairperson of the Meretz Party.
Hello.
Thanks for joining us. Hi.
Thank
We
you.
have with us Ariel Kahana, senior diplomatic correspondent from Israel Hayom.
Shalom. Hi. Thanks for having me.
Great. And Owen Alterman, senior correspondent and political analyst from I-24.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
Great. And last but certainly not least, Tal Shalev, political correspondent and analyst from Walla News.
Hi, good evening.
Hey, thanks so much, everybody, for being here. So want to just get us started by leveling the playing field, as I like to call it, understanding how we even got to a fourth election, the fourth election in 2 years. Owen, if we can actually start with you, can you give us a quick background? Tell us what happened.
Sure. Well, first of all, I just wanted to thank you again, Mayan, and thank the Israeli American Council for having us. I have incredible memories from the Dor Hadash organization when I lived in New York before making Aliyah that ultimately was folded into the IAC. So thanks so much. It's great to be with everybody. As for the elections, the way I like to think about it is that there are three reasons. Two of them are tactical, you could say political. And the third one, which I think is actually maybe the most interesting, is deeper, maybe even sociological. The two tactical reasons, number one, we had a government that just wasn't functioning very well. It was this complicated two-headed government, right? With Netanyahu as prime minister, with Benny Gantz as alternate prime minister. And they simply they locked horns from the get-go. The government wasn't able to make decisions. They were always fighting with each other. And it was just a matter of time until it was going to break down. That's one way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it, of course, this is the second reason, is that we have a prime minister who would have been forced to hand over power to Gantz under the coalition agreement in November and not be prime minister. For a lot of reasons, he didn't want to do that. And to make a long story short, the best and easiest way for him to get out of that deal was to have elections now. And so that's, in one way, the reason why the elections are brought up. The deeper reason why we continue and keep on having election after election after election, to me, is maybe the most interesting. And that's because we have two splits within the Israeli right that have made it impossible, at least at this point, to form a clean, from the right wing's perspective, right-wing government. If you think about it in a wider sense, between 2009 and 2019, for most of that period of time, there was a right-wing coalition that governed the country. It included the Likud party, it included the Haredi parties, included the national religious sector, included Avigdor Lieberman's party, which at its base is mostly of Russian immigrants. And that coalition broke down for two reasons. Number one, you had a group of voters led by Avigdor Lieberman that decided it was more important to oppose the Haredi sector than to form a right-wing government. That issue of religion and state was more important to them than the right-wing issues. And that was one split. It wasn't a lot of people who felt that way, but it was enough to help tip the balance. And the other split, of course, is around the personality of Netanyahu. That there was a small, but maybe growing, maybe something we can talk about, number of right-wing voters for whom it's more important to replace Netanyahu as prime minister than it is to have that right-wing government. And when you have people for whom it's more important to have this religion and state and Haredi issue than it is to form a right-wing government, and you have another group of voters for whom the Netanyahu issue is more important than forming a right-wing government, then it stands to reason it's going to be much harder to form that right-wing coalition. And on the other hand, we don't have a center-left or left-wing coalition because the numbers simply aren't there. They came, of course, very close after the third election, but they couldn't quite get to that number of 61. The last thing I guess to say is these two groups, the group that prioritizes the Haredi issue over the right-wing government issue, the group that prioritizes the Netanyahu issue over the right-wing government issue, are led by politicians who may or may not care about those issues specifically. These are ambitious politicians who want power, want to be prime minister, but they couldn't do it without the voters. They had to convince hundreds of thousands of Israelis to vote with them. And they've done it, at least so far. And that's why we're, and I think at a deeper level, where we're at. And of course, the big question over the next 2 months is, are we going to stay there? Or on March 23rd, are we going to have Israeli voters who lead us more definitively in one direction or another?
Well, thanks so much, Owen. That's really helpful. And as you mentioned, the elections are March 23rd. That's really just shy of 2 months from now. And a lot can change. It changes rapidly, much more rapidly today than it ever did in the past as people have more access to information, social media. And certainly we know that we're getting closer and closer to Netanyahu's trial, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Ariel, I actually want to move over to you, if it's okay, and talk a little bit about another election that just happened. We just had a American election, and the American people elected President Joe Biden, who just took office. So, Ariel, tell me, what impact is the absence, I would say, of President Donald Trump and the presence of Joe Biden going to have on this race in Israel?
Thanks, Mayan, and thanks everyone for having me. Let's just remind that I'm replacing Boaz Bismuth. But those of you who learned to know Boaz know that he can't be replaced. In any case, going to your question, Mayan, so I think the absence of President Trump won't affect the elections too much, because there is no doubt that when it comes to international issues, to foreign and security issues, especially foreign issues, Netanyahu is the best. And even Bennett or Saar, who tried to challenge him, even Bogi Ya'alon, that I interviewed just today, said that when it comes to national security issues or foreign policy issues, Netanyahu is doing a good job. So it's quite a common wisdom on all sides of the political map that when it comes to U.S.-American ties and so on, Netanyahu is doing his job and it's okay. So and by the way, whether it's a Republican administration or a Democratic administration, I would at least I think in the center right of the map, people rely on Netanyahu as one who would know how to handle that. And again, it doesn't matter even if it's Netanyahu, even if it's a Trump or Biden. If I may, I do want to comment about the general picture of the elections, because as Owen said, actually we are in a very, very early stage. The picture we see now is not what we're going to see in the coming weeks, especially when it will come to the deadlines that in the center left, parties will have to unite to join forces. We also see the polls changing in almost in daily basis. The numbers are changing, so the system, the political system, is not stable now, and it's too early to call.
Well, and I think that is important, because only by February 4th do the parties even have to register their lists, which means that there's still time for many of the parties to decide who they're going to join with and what those lists are going to look like. But Nitzan, let's turn over to you just for a moment. Now, you've maintained connections with the Democratic Party in the United States for a long time. And despite what Ariel said, I think there were Democratic presidents that have not been as close with Netanyahu as, let's say, President Donald Trump. In past Democratic candidates have even tried to intervene to remove Netanyahu from office, whether that was Bill Clinton or Barack Obama, who we know did not hide his animosity for Netanyahu. That came out pretty openly. Tell me, would you encourage the Democrats to find ways to get involved, as they have in the past, to try to remove Netanyahu from power, for the good of Israel and America, of course?
Look, your assumption is unfortunately not correct. First of all, Netanyahu did not hide his animosity to President Obama. So, it was, let's say, mutually problematic, okay? So let's put it this way. Anyway, each and every American administration interfered in Israeli politics or in the politics of other countries as well around the globe. So this is not a new phenomena. Let me, as far as I know, in the last 10 years or so, there was no direct interference of any American president in Israeli politics or Israeli election. The inauguration of President Biden.
Yes. Sorry, I shouldn't have said direct. I mean, more.
No, I'm happy with the victory and the inauguration of President Biden and Vice President Harris. I think this is something which is very good for Israel. I hope this new American administration, will renew the peace process between us and the Palestinians. and will also push for a new Iran deal, which also I think is for the best interests of Israel, since without a deal, Iran is moving forward towards a nuclear weapon, something which nobody wants. So we think that the best way to deter Iran is by a new nuclear deal, and this is the intent of the Biden administration, which makes us quite pleased with this new direction. Now, in terms of the election here, I think that a new government here, center-left government or another government without Netanyahu, will be able to move forward those issues that were pushed aside in the last 4 or 5 years, primarily the peace process with the Palestinians and other regional political issues. Now, I think that there is a great opportunity now, both for Israel and the United States, to strengthen ties. And there is also one thing that we should say. Most of the American Jewish community voted Democratic and supported Biden. And I think Israel should not disregard this and should not ignore this. And Israel should listen to the American Jewish community in their hope for tikkun, for tikkun, which is a very important Jewish term, tikkun of racial relations, of anti-Semitism, of this hatred. And I think Israel should play part in bringing us two peoples together and bringing the American Jewish community closer to Israel. And this is the time to do it.
Thank you for that. Well, you mentioned somebody who was just put into office, which is Vice President Kamala Harris. She is the first woman to be elected vice president. And, it's interesting when we look now at what's happening here in Israel, the only women leaders, there are some women leaders of parties, but none that are expected to head lists. Even Merav Michaeli, winning Labor tonight, is not expected to lead that list. So we might end up having 30 lists without a single woman heading one of them. So Tal, I wanted to turn to you. What does that say about a country like Israel that once bragged that we were one of the first in the world to have a female prime minister?
Hi, everyone. So I think that, first of all, we should say that today and just like an hour ago, Merav Michaeli was elected as the only current party leader in Israel who is a woman, and we should put a better situation, which we were in the previous elections, in which no woman was leading any party. So we should know how to celebrate, our small achievements. I think that at large, I was also grown up on a myth that Israel is an extremely, egalitarian society, and that we had a woman prime minister and women took equal part in the kibbutz movement, and the women are in the army, and I was a commander in the army, and I had male soldiers who I commanded. But then when you grow up and you look at the system, and specifically the political system, you see that Israel is a much more militaristic and patriarchalic, whatever, you know what I meant, society than we tend to admit. Another thing that we should note is that, and this is larger than gender, but one of the things that has happened to the political system in the past few years is that we don't have inner democratic processes inside the parties. Instead of having, traditional parties, we have Nitzan with us. Meretz is a traditional party, but most of the parties, besides Labor and Likud, of course, are parties which have been invented in the past decade or so by specific personalities and are run like a company and not like what you, specifically Americans, know as a democratic party. And I think that in that kind of process, gender does play a role, because it's a political of ego. It's a politics of egos. I think that women do not feel so entitled as many of these men have done. Some of them feel. And another thing just to note, is that, one of the main, jump points into Israeli politics that brings you to senior positions is a military career. We, of course, have just seen in the past 2 years or so that does not mean that you're going to be a political success, but it does give you an easy way or an easier way to the top, which women just don't have because they don't get to these ranks.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. I want to stick with you, Tal, just for a minute and talk about the Prime Minister. So the Prime Minister has been indicted for bribery, as you know, in the Bezic Walla affair. And you were not working at Walla at the time. But I was wondering, what impact you see that the Prime Minister's trial starting when it's going to be starting, which is in the next a couple of weeks already. I think we're already at, right? The beginning of February is the first hearing, or the next hearing. And I'm wondering if that's going to have an impact on his ability to stay in power.
I got to say that I don't think so. I think that, Netanyahu has been under some criminal or legal process in the past 3 elections. And I think that all of his legal trouble is already embodied inside his supporters. He has a group of supporters who already know that he's on trial. And I don't think that the fact that they will see a picture of him arriving to court will necessarily change the situation. I think that after 3 elections, this is the 4th election that have been mainly about Netanyahu's trial. The divide is between a camp that thinks that Netanyahu can continue to be prime minister even though he's under trial, and the camp that says he should stop serving as prime minister and he needs to be replaced. So I don't think that anything new can be injected into this divide one way or another. I do think that, but just to add on that, I do think that a much bigger enemy or a much bigger risk for Netanyahu could be COVID-19, as we know is an unexpected pandemic. At the moment, Israel is succeeding phenomenally with the vaccination, with the vaccinations, but as it is we don't know to predict how the virus will be acting and what will happen before the elections, and that definitely could be much more dangerous for Netanyahu, in my opinion, than the trial.
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, thinking about actually the fact that really there were 2 elections, or at least the last election, right, in the shadow of the last one, in the shadow of what was the beginning of COVID-19. And we saw the impact there. But look, also as the vaccines we're doing an amazing job at our vaccination worldwide. We're renowned, but we shut down the airport today, just a couple of hours ago. And so we have to, I think, Tal is really right in that we have to remember that the impact of COVID-19 is going to be whether or not we're driving to voting booths with people wearing hazmat suits or not, whether elderly are afraid to go out or not. All of these things.
And just to add and sum up and say that it could very well play for Netanyahu and in Netanyahu's, if the vaccinations continue successfully as they have up until now, then Netanyahu probably will be able to gain support over that, or at least hold on to support. But on the other hand, you can also lose a lot if the airport is closed, or if infection rates continue to be high.
Or in fact, if he doesn't crack down on the Haredim, which Nitzan, let's turn over to you for a minute, and I'd like you to take that question as well. What are your thoughts? Netanyahu on trial, COVID-19, let's add that to the mix. Do we think that either of those 2 things are going to impact Netanyahu's ability to stay in power?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that already in the last 3 rounds of election, Netanyahu couldn't get the necessary majority in order to form a stable right-wing government under his leadership. And so this is why we're in a 4th, unprecedented, crazy 4th round of election, something which maybe our American viewers can hardly understand. But this is the situation here. We're in the 4th round of election in less than 2 years. Like every 8 or 7 months, we go to the polls again and again and again. And now this time as well, because of the huge economic crisis, because of the mismanagement of the health issue, the corona issue, and of course all sorts of problems with different sectors of Israeli society, then again it's hard for Netanyahu to consolidate the necessary majority. We see another very important phenomena in this election is that from the right wing, something that we didn't see before, from inside the Likud, even his own party, there are people who challenge him. For instance, Gideon Saar or Bennett challenging him for the prime ministership. something which didn't exist before. Netanyahu was the only, let's say, the only power on the right-wing side, but this time he has rivals. He has pretenders, and so this is something new. Something also which is new in this election is this acceptance of the Arab participation. So far, it was sort of a taboo in Israeli politics. The Arab parties were left out, but in the last year or so, there are developments inside Israeli society which makes the possibility of participation with the Joint Arab List or with some members of the Knesset from the Arab society a possibility, a probability maybe. And so this is something that would make it even harder for Netanyahu to get the necessary majority on the fourth round of elections. So putting all those elements together, there is a very, I would say, credible scenario that a coalition of different parties would form a new type of government without Netanyahu and the Likud. This is, of course...
Let's stick with that for a minute, okay?
Yes.
So you yourself, are heading up a party that is actually on the left side of the system. We talked a little bit about the challenge of center and center left forming coalitions in this country. It's been a long time. And there's been a lot of talk of mergers in order to strengthen the center and the center left. But your party says you're going to go out, you said you're going to go at it alone. Correct?
Right.
So aren't you a little worried that you might not cross the thresholds, which in fact would help Netanyahu stay in power?
No, because we are a stable and solid party. We've been around for many, many years. We are one of the founding elements of the Zionist movement more than 100 years ago even. So we long back in history. And so, no, I have no fear for Meretz not passing. On the contrary, we're getting stronger, and I'm confident that we'll get a nice score. The thing is that we're a left-wing party, a progressive, social democratic. We are not center-left. We are not center-right. We are not center. We're progressive party, as you say in the U.S. And this is our ideology. And we do not see any suitable partners for all sorts of combinations. We tried those things before in the second and on the third round of election with the former Labour Party, with some other personalities. And it was quite problematic. I think that Netanyahu got his majority on the last time because some of the people on the center-left camp sort of defected, sort of shifted to his side, and we would not like to repeat this experiment. So Meretz will go on its own under its flag. Maybe there would be a sort of a union or a new party formed with all those fractions of those new parties that Tal discussed earlier. Maybe this mayor of Tel Aviv, maybe the Labour Party, maybe some other new parties formed recently. Maybe they would join forces and go together. But anyway, Meretz, and this is very important to emphasize, Meretz is up to alliances depending on the situation. We are not putting anybody aside. I mean, we would not sit with Netanyahu, that's clear, because he is indicted with criminal charges. But beside him, we will discuss with each and every head of party in Israel. We will hear them, we will talk to them, and we will decide. And I think that Meretz will be a crucial element in the political game right after the coming election.
Got it. Well, let's go back to you, Owen, for just a minute. Assuming that Israelis turn out and go to the polls, vote in the next group that could potentially be a government. What do you think? Will there be a fifth election?
Especially about
you're on mute, I think, if you can. Go ahead.
Do you hear me?
Yep, now we can.
Okay, great. I was just saying, it's like the old Yogi Berra saying, it's hard to make predictions, especially about the future. But I guess as you look at this question, there are three main scenarios and two, I guess you could say, wild cards. The three main scenarios: number one, a clean, so to speak, right-wing government led by Netanyahu. Number two, the government that Nitzan Horowitz just talked about, a broad non-Netanyahu coalition that would include some right-wing parties, some center-right parties, some center-left parties, and I think we just heard potentially a left-wing party as well, if the others would be interested, which is interesting enough. That's the second scenario. And the third scenario, of course, is the continued stalemate in a fifth election. Judging between the three, I don't think any of them has a greater than 50% chance. If you look at most of the polls most of the time right now, the most likely scenario is a fifth election, but it's very, very close. Each of those two other groups, the right-wing government and the not Bibi government, each of them can often come very, very close to the 61 seats in the Knesset that they need to form a government in most of the polls. So it really, really is very, very close. There are going to be two wild cards, or I guess you could say wild cards, that are going to make a big difference down the stretch. And we've already touched on both of them. Number one, Tal talked about it, Mayan, you talked about it, and it's the pandemic. If we've learned nothing else in the last 10, 11 months, we've learned just how much of a wild card this can be. Prime Minister Netanyahu, when he started this election campaign, especially when he saw the success of the vaccination campaign, thought that he was going to get a post-pandemic election. It sure doesn't look like it at this point. This virus is going to be with us. The pandemic is going to be with us. And who knows in March 23rd what it's going to look like. Could make a big difference, not only in the voting process, as you mentioned, Mayan, but also potentially in the election results. So that's number one. And number two, the other thing that that you were all speaking about just a moment ago, this issue of which parties and whether the parties in the center left are going to merge. February 4th, as you mentioned, Mayan, is the deadline for submitting lists. Are these parties going to succeed in coming together? The parties that aren't going to cross the threshold, are they going to drop out? How many votes are so-called going to be wasted? Because as I think a lot of our viewers know, you need to get 3.25% of the vote on March 23rd to get any seats in the parliament. And if you get 3.2499999% of the votes, then you're wiped out and you don't get any seats in the Knesset. And all of those votes go in the garbage can. And so if there are a lot of votes in the center left that are wasted, for that matter, if there are votes in the right that are wasted, and that could happen in one case with the Religious Zionist Party, if there are a lot of votes that are put in the garbage, and again, it's a particular risk on the center left because of the number of parties out there that aren't crossing the threshold, that could make a big difference too. But listen, at this point, it looks like it's going to be very close. If you put a gun to my head, I'd say there is going to be a fifth election. But really, if you look at the numbers,
no.
Two other scenarios could be potentially realistic.
No fifth election. No.
I know whenever people say that, I say, no, stop. Right, we've had enough.
Yeah.
It is interesting. I remember when Netanyahu rolled out the vaccine campaign and said that we had this deal with Pfizer, and he said any Israeli who wants to will be vaccinated by the end of March, if not before. Those were his words. And thinking to myself, oh, how convenient for Netanyahu. By the end of March, if not before. In other words, by March 23rd. But as we're seeing, this pandemic has a life of its own, and these vaccines might not actually be the magic wand that I think Netanyahu was hoping for. So I want to just go one by one, going back, starting with you, Ariel, and asking you the big question. Come March 23rd, everyone comes out to vote. Within 60 days, we form a government, if all goes well. Who is going to be our prime minister? Is it going to be the current prime minister Benjamin Netanyahu? Ariel?
Yeah. So as I said before, it's and as Owen said, it's very hard to predict. Of course, I do see fifth elections as I would say main scenario because the polls are stable in one way, and that is that each side do not have 61 seats. And therefore, because Netanyahu in any combination do not cross the 61, and the same with his rivals. So fifth election are definitely a possibility. And afterwards, I would say a right-wing government between Netanyahu, the Orthodox, and Naftali Bennett, and with the Smotrich as well, because they are now separate those national religious parties. So definitely it might happen. And by the way, whether Netanyahu will have a new government or there will be fifth elections he is still the prime minister, and in some way he doesn't mind if it will go to fifth elections. It's his interest. But I do want to say one word, if we may, Maya, not only to talk about politics, but also about policy. I just want to mention that, in my view, it was a little bit weird that Nitzan Horowitz, I would say, bypassed the Biden administration from the left, because Antony Blinken said in the Senate that he did not expect any possibility to agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. So I don't know why Nitzan was talking about it. And the same about the JCPOA. The president said clearly he wants to fix the agreement. So I don't know. I'm sure, I know that the vast majority of Israelis has quite clear opinion about those two issues, and I hope, and actually I know our government is working about it, that now to coordinate both issues, the Palestinian and mainly the Iranian issue, with the new administration.
Great. So I want to bring it back to you, Nitzan. You have a minute and a half to respond to Ariel, and also let us know what your thoughts are. Come 60 days from the next election, who will be sitting there as prime minister? Will it be the man who sits there today?
59 days. It's important. Each
Right.
day. Look, we're in the midst of a crazy roller coaster ride. This is a very unstable situation. We have a pandemic going around. We have so many new parties, new developments in Israeli politics. Nobody really knows. Really, nobody really knows. If you look at the polls 2 months before, you see the changes. Anything can happen in those 2 months. So everything is possible. Really, everything is possible. I do not think we're heading towards a fifth election. I do not think so. I think that there will be a government. I hope personally that Netanyahu will no longer be Israeli prime minister, but it depends on the results. There is, and I'm talking from, as I say, personal experience and personal knowledge. There is a possibility for a new type of coalition, which would be a more sort of mixed, and not just partisan, right, one side would be something new. I don't know exactly how, but it is possible, and people are discussing it right now. Now, the fact is that there is a new sort of bloc within the right wing that for the first time say clearly that they oppose Netanyahu. This is something new. And based on that, it is possible maybe to build something after the election. And as I said, also for Meretz, a left-wing party, very progressive, we will discuss with everybody, and we'll hear everybody, and we'll decide. We do not make any assumptions ahead, and we are open for each and every discussion with the person who gets the mandate to form the government. So this is something new also for us, and I'm hopeful that maybe we'll follow your example. In Washington, we'll have a new leader in 2 months. I think that would be best for Israel.
Thank you for that. So Tal, I want to end with you actually on talking about two quick issues. One is the ultra-Orthodox, which we haven't brought up till now. And the ultra-Orthodox have obviously been a very large part of the coalition. So what is going to happen with them in this election, and how is that going to impact the results?
Well, the ultra-Orthodox voters, I should say, are usually quite disciplined. And they're considered much more disciplined, I would say, than any other group in Israel.
Only
because
they would be disciplined with handling the coronavirus rules.
Well, yeah, they're disciplined in their voting. They do what the rabbis tell them, and that's also what they've been doing with the coronavirus rules. I think that the issue with the ultra-Orthodox parties is more about the agenda that's going to be what's going to be discussed in the weeks up until the election. What we are seeing in the past few days, weeks, months, there have been so many instances of cases and I would say mini scandals or news focuses on what's going on in the ultra-Orthodox communities with not fulfilling the rules, opening the schools when the government is closing them, having huge weddings while, gatherings are banned. I think that this agenda is a bad agenda for Netanyahu because Netanyahu has a very close political alliance with the ultra-Orthodox party. So it's easy to stick to him any discontent that has to do with this. And there is a lot of discontent and it's growing. You're hearing more and more secular people, and not only secular people, also whoever's not ultra-Orthodox, who are becoming very, very angry and very mad with the fact that they have to sit especially with the children, and they have to sit at home with their children for weeks while the ultra-Orthodox schools are working almost as usual. So I think that this is a bad agenda for Netanyahu. It highlights his alliance with the ultra-Orthodox parties, and that he will be trying to deviate from this and try to take it away, take our eyes away from it. But it's not up to him. It's really up to these really small autonomies that we have discovered in the past year inside the ultra-Orthodox communities.
Interesting. And if Netanyahu does not align with the ultra-Orthodox, will that impact his results?
I don't think he has a chance in aligning with them because they are his most loyal, most loyal allies. They have been, they're the last survivors that have been with him, especially for the past 2 years when he has been fighting for his survival, and they have been his most loyal allies. So, and Netanyahu, if there's one thing that he doesn't do, he usually keeps his base very, very close. So it would be very unnatural for him to disavow his alliance or relationship with the ultra-Orthodox parties at this point.
Got it. Okay. Well, thank you all so much for being with us today. It was such a pleasure to hear from all of you. MK Nitzan Horowitz, of course, Ariel Kahana, Owen Alterman, and Tal Shalev. Thank you for being with us. I want to remind all of our listeners, live I see hi from New Jersey and California. It's so great to have you here, that we will have another session, a special Hebrew election session on February 14th. So anybody who is relevant and interested in joining that, we look forward to having you. And thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
להתראות.